Hello. For this episode of the As for Architecture podcast, I was joined by Dr. Géraldine Borio, Swiss architect, founder of Borio Lab and previously Parallel Lab, and now also assistant professor in the Department of Architecture at the University of Hong Kong. We met on the internet, where else, to discuss her exquisite, enigmatic and inspiring book, Looking for the Voids, Learning from Asia's Liminal Urban Spaces as a Foundation to Expand an Architectural Practice, published by Park Books in 2023. We discussed Géraldine's analysis of informal architectural events in leftover urban spaces across Bangkok, Hong Kong and Seoul that are productive, hybrid and amorphous, and possibly pertinent to liminal spaces in other places.
A is for Architecture, a podcast about architecture, buildings, urban culture and space.
Hello and welcome to another episode of As for Architecture. I'm talking today to scholar and architect Géraldine Borio. Géraldine, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. It's a real delight. We're going to be talking about your recently published book, Looking for the Voids, Learning from Asia's Liminal Urban Spaces as a Foundation to Expand an Architectural Practice, which is an excellent subtitle, published by Park Books. Géraldine, before we get into some of that, would you be so kind as to introduce yourself, please?
Well, thank you very much for your introduction and for having me. I'm originally from Switzerland. I grew up and was born there. And very soon after my studies, I moved to Asia, where I'm living since about almost 2 decades now. And I'm currently an assistant professor at the University of Hong Kong. And as we're talking now, I'm in Seoul.
How come you're in Seoul and not in Hong Kong?
I was just in Hong Kong last week, and now I moved to Seoul because there will be the release of my new book next weekend. So I'm here for that.
Oh, I see. So you're here for a kind of a talking tour.
No, I mean a new book, another book is coming out on Seoul.
Okay. And what's this new book?
Well, it's on a similar kind of in-between conditions that I've been studying for so many years. And this one is specifically about the mini mountains within the cities. And I'm looking at the city from this kind of different point of view, looking at these kind of gaps, not necessarily plans, and see how it can provide a different reading of the city.
That's very interesting. As I said before we started recording, I lived in Seoul for 6 months and I felt so at sea. It was so foreign to what I expected from an urban space. As you say, these mountains in the city that are really quite mountainous, you know. In England, I think in Britain generally, our mountains are quite garden-like, but this is not the same at all in Seoul, is it? So where did you train? How did you come to architecture?
Well, I did my study at EPFL in Lausanne, Switzerland. And most of my childhood I spent in Switzerland. But right after the studies, I took the train and went to Asia. And then I did my PhD at RMIT in Australia. That was a few years after that.
And what was your PhD in?
Well, it was definitely about somehow the content of the book.
Mm-hmm. Maybe we should start with that. Where does this book come from? How did you, a Swiss, I'm assuming, fairly urban person, come to...
Not really urban.
You're not urban?
No, I will say that, this book came out, it's a very kind of a long process.
Mm-hmm.
Basically, I wanted to look back at those 15 years of practice and researching that I did in Asia. And so while I was beginning really my architectural life as a kind of a fresh graduate in Asia, I wanted to live there, I wanted to observe the cities. So I started my observations through the city of Bangkok. I looked at the leftover spaces under the expressway, elevated expressways. And then I went to Hong Kong, by walking through the street, I discovered a network of very kind of tiny lanes, back lanes, interstitial spaces. And I started really to kind of record the mechanism that were happening in these lanes. And all these kind of observations also, of course, like influenced the way I was kind of practicing architecture. So at some point I was also doing my own practice in Hong Kong, where I was able to test spatially a little bit what I observed in the street and trying to see how we could learn from these specific areas and how this can also influence the way we do architecture. So the book is really about through these 15 years of practice, I've observed and analyzed 5 main sites, I would say, in Bangkok, 3 in Hong Kong, and 1 in Seoul. And so in parallel, I also reanalyze my own spatial projects, so 5 also spatial projects. And I was trying to see and to reflect on the mechanism of observing and the mechanism of doing spaces and how somehow they interact and what could we extract as a kind of a learning from that.
So there's a sort of lovely theme here of the everyday experiences of cities, which goes beyond the master planning, totalizing vision that, generally speaking, we use to describe urban space, geographical space, which I think is fascinating. And then there's this other aspect, which is this intervention and observing the impacts of that, which is something very close to my heart. So I was very fascinated by that. What's the theoretical background for your work, other than this everyday thing and other than your practice? What underpins it? Is there a body of literature in architecture or on the edges of architecture that deals with this?
Well, I have to say, all my research are very grounded on the street observations, and I'm not so much on a kind of a theory. So I really wanted to approach the city from a very kind of fresh look. And therefore, for instance, for the sites themselves that I observed, I look for places that people didn't really write too much about, because I didn't want it to be too much influence about that. So therefore, a long time ago, when I studied Bangkok, there were not so much literature about it. Hong Kong, the in-betweens at that time, not so much. And I wanted to kind of course, my background is from Switzerland, and there I got the theoretical tool to analyze cities. But then the way we analyze cities are, of course, because there are, let's say, long histories of layers, but somehow we can read them, how to say, yeah, we have the tools in Switzerland to know how to read, like the mechanism of making cities, the plaza and the streets, and then, like all these things that were kind of happening along the histories. But my interest was also to see how to apply these tools from a European background to this very new context and foreign context to me, which, of course, at first sounds or look a little bit chaotic, I would say. But then I didn't really believe that. I also believed that there were kind of logic within the mechanism of the cities, but this logic had to be yet to be discovered. And so these translations, of tools from my background, like from Switzerland to Asia, was maybe the foundation of the theory, I would say, perhaps.
But not sort of studies in informal architecture by people like Kim Dovey and vernacular architecture studies and so on. Not that world.
Well, I not so much from the books, no. But I did a long time ago. I also worked with Atelier Bauer in Tokyo, and also from direct, like practicing architecture with them. I've also learned from their kind of way of looking at the cities, and probably most of the theory, I would say, was kind of also influenced by their approach, for sure. As a very fresh comer from Europe, going to Tokyo, learning, the way of looking at the city of Tokyo. Of course, this is, I guess, my main influence, for sure.
I'm interested in this idea of this other modern that exists in East Asia. So if we've got these kind of modernist tools for exploring and understanding and then defining and designing urban and city space, what did you find that was principally significant? I don't want to get into the five principles in your book quite yet, but what did you find that was different? I mean, in what way is this another modern? And that's a big bloody question, by the way.
It's not that very easy.
No.
Another modern, do you mean like not postmodern, right?
I'm thinking here about Jennifer Robinson's Ordinary Cities Between Modernity and Development, which she published must be 20 odd years ago now, or maybe 15, 20 years ago, where there is this idea that modernity is often described, or modernization is often described as this kind of process towards westernization, that
Mhm.
the West originated modernity, and that what we see when we see Rio de Janeiro or Cape Town or Bangkok modernizing is a trajectory towards what we in the West, and particularly in America, have already achieved. And her argument in that was that actually there's a completely different kind of logic at play here. I guess I'm asking, like, what is the logic that you're kind of trying to understand? What is the logic, the overarching logic at play in this form of East Asian urbanization?
Well, I guess that it's very hybrid, I would say. So I guess that a lot of it, a lot of those mechanisms have, as you say, like a very modern is the applications of, maybe in terms of technology, also like the infrastructure development, in a way very westernized. But then there's also this kind of shift or this kind of twist. But it's very difficult for me to say what is that and what is that, because at the end it's a very hybrid situations. And you will not expect, for example, when I mentioned previously, like the tools for reading the cities. So traditional cities in Europe, I will, like look at the plan and read through the layers, and you will find it very difficult to apply to a similar context as Bangkok, where all the layers are kind of superimposed and it sounds very chaotic. But in fact, in a way, when you decompose the context, the mechanisms are not so different in a way. They also have kind of their own logic, which is perhaps not exactly the same, but there is a logic, as opposite as a very chaotic. So I would say it's very mixed. We all absorb, I guess, like like these things. Like even myself, I don't know. I guess it's this influence from the West and then
Mm-hmm.
from Asia. I can't really detach them from one to another. So.
No. Culture is very powerful, possibly the
Mm.
most powerful thing that we deal with. Can you describe in a little bit more detail this method of looking that you undertook? I assume, and just in sort of the implication of what you've said, that it was initially simply through the process of, walking to work or walking to college or whatever it is, and then you suddenly sort of start paying attention. How do you turn the paying attention into a methodology from which you can
Mhm.
derive robust and meaningful new data?
Well, I would say exactly as you mentioned. So it starts with the walking through the cities and trying to also kind of make sense of what I see. And very often I discover situations where I cannot make sense. I cannot really understand the logic of why this situation is happening, trying to understand it. And then it's really when it starts to trigger my interest and my attention. So then I need to look for other ways to understand why this situation is happening. So the idea is basically I go back to the map. I go back to the map I found, all sorts of maps, but more specifically historical maps, and I try to understand the different layers, why this situation is happening. So I'm looking for other sources of information, or historical data, for instance. And when I still cannot find more, then I go back maybe to the terrain, ask people around, but from the users, but also from maybe the politicians or the planners. I'm trying to kind of gather all sorts of informations, and I recreating my own understanding of why this situation is happening. So I guess, yeah, that's
Is it a form
my.
of ethnography?
I don't know. I'm not an ethnographer.
I think you are, by the way. But anyway, it seems to me to be sort of critical ethnographic practice.
Well, but always with the space in vision. So it's always a space that I'm trying to understand, and a type of space I'm trying to understand. But yeah, maybe through using ethnographical tools.
Mm.
But I will say this is also very much about observing, being an architect and observing, like the context around.
So how does the design work then respond to and interact with that? And what motivated the intuition, I suppose, you had that design intervention was another tool in this?
Mm. Well, sometimes the maps or asking questions is not enough. So, for example, for one of the projects in Hong Kong in the backlanes, I felt the need to become also an actor within the space. So therefore, I developed a tool. Basically, it's a stool that can be folded as a backpack. And that was somehow a tool to investigate further the mechanism of those lanes. So by using an object or organizing some happenings within the lanes, I got direct feedbacks from the context, whether it's the users, whether it's really the context itself. So that's in a way to learn more, basically.
Because you interrupt.
Because I interact, because I invite also other people to engage within the site. So for example, we built 120 of these little stools, so organizing happenings in the back lanes. We were able to test also the capacity of the lanes, but also things that are less tangible, such as, like the legal aspect of what you can do, what you cannot do. And these specifically for these in-between spaces where things are not really defined. No one will really tell you you can do that. This is a public space or this is a private space. I struggle with that. So by directly intervening with the space, I got feedbacks and it confirmed basically my kind of assumptions.
And is this approach directed at understanding the social fabric of the space, or more precisely, the interaction between social fabric and material culture and space?
Not so much the social fabric. Of course, like observing the users and observing the mechanism that were at stakes within the lanes is my main interest. But I would say it's more that I wanted to grasp, like to learn how, this place were kind of working, perhaps also more as an attempt to, when myself I designed space, how, could I play with this kind of similar ingredients, perhaps.
Okay. And these ingredients you've coalesced into 5 key principles, core principles, without wishing you to just read the book. And these core principles, by the way, are presented in this, as I said to you before we started recording, an extraordinarily beautiful piece of publication. I mean, architecture
Thank you.
books, well, I mean, it really is quite something else, featuring beautifully, I mean, it's beautifully typeset. I don't know, did you do this yourself or was this the work of Park Books?
No, I work with a really fantastic graphic designer, Ludovic Ballon and Anina Shipping. They're from Switzerland and they are friends and they're really, really excellent. And
I have to
yeah.
say, it does feel quite Swiss. It is. It is the Swiss Army knife of books. It does all things and it has lots of folding parts, which I really like. But don't say this lightly, but I would strongly advocate people following the links in the podcast and buying it. But could you come to these 5 core principles? As I say, what are they? And I guess, how did you discern them?
Yeah, so while I was really reflecting on these 15 years of practice, and I really selected like these 5 sites and 5 kind of spatial projects, I start really my wish was to find maybe to find a way to put to give out the learning basically that I get while observing, but also while making. So somehow there are kind of a concentrations of these learnings. And to me, I see them not as a recipe on how to do architecture, but I see them as maybe some kind of guidelines or pieces of reflections that we could have before starting a project. Or at least this is what I'm kind of thinking, or what I realized I was thinking about before starting a project. So maybe it brings a kind of an awareness of things we could do differently, perhaps, as we used to do as an architecture. So they are specifically also addressed to architects
Mm.
and not to the users, of course.
Right, that's a controversial point. You might not think so, but how do architects customarily do things? They get their site,
Mhm.
they fill the site with a building, and they think a little bit about the pavement and how dumper trucks and fire engines get in. And you're kind of challenging this.
So let's say, for example, the first principle, which is defining the void. So this is really at the core of the book, because the title of the book is Looking for the Void. So I was really always attracted to this notion of void or interruptions or kind of accidents. But then I realized more and more I was looking at those voids that are not planned, but are still existing within the cities, that somehow they were very far from being empty. And I was really interested in that, in the fact that they were still so important for the city. For instance, for the inhabitant, they allow them to breathe within the cities. So this kind of quality of emptiness that is not empty is something that I wish we could have or bring back to architecture. So before starting a project, I will really usually look at where we should not build before doing anything. What kind of void should we save? That could be physical void, but that could be also the absence of something. It could be incompleteness, for instance, or that could also be even removing something. So paying attention first why we should not build, where we should not build, or what we should preserve before acting. This is somehow what I wanted to share as one of the most, was one of the learning I got.
But a void is not just an absence of stuff. A void is a type of urban absence which has specific characteristics. Am I right in thinking that? It's not all empty space. It's not under every motorway or...
Definitely not, but as a practitioner, if you want things to happen, if you want, for instance, spontaneity to happen, you need to offer space for that.
Hmm.
And I would say it's really kind of going against this idea of controlling,
Hmm.
things that could happen, because one of the wish we always have as architect is that the user are happy in our building and they use the space spontaneously. But there is always, I mean, even myself, I tested that somehow we want to control, the fact that this could eventually happen. And I realized it's only by setting back or withdrawing from our position of controlling that things potentially could happen. So it's kind of a giving back
Hmm.
something.
So how do we define the void? In the case studies that you use and have explored, are there consistent characteristics across these three cities, across Hong Kong, Seoul, and Bangkok? Is there a character to the boundary edges of these places? Is there a type of behavior that is facilitated? Are there modes of spatial reproduction which are invited or made more likely to occur through organization? For example, does it happen where buildings are not too high, where sun can penetrate, where informal markets are possible, or forms of informal exchange?
Well, I will say, first of all, I will observe the situation. And most of the time, everything is there. And there might be something, as you mentioned, boundaries are really important. So really understanding this, like those boundaries, are they too fixed? Should we remove? But also maybe boundaries could be very useful because they also maintain these voids, right? So clearly defining the boundaries of the voids and sometimes even reinforcing them is a way to preserve somehow the void. There could be legal boundaries, for instance, or there could be physical, tangible boundaries. But observing and noticing what needs to be preserved and just not intervening
Mhm.
within the perimeter of those boundaries.
In your third principle,
Mhm.
expanded boundaries, you then challenge this idea that the boundedness isn't bounded in perhaps the Nolly plan kind of way. Not in that kind of, as you say, classical European modern tools for exploring sites, but is territorial. These are porous boundaries. Could you talk to that a little?
Yeah, so well, there is always, specifically in very congested space, there is always the wish to have more space and to kind of go beyond. And I noticed that sometimes, of course, like there are the work on the tangible boundaries, providing interactions or flexibility or porosity between inside and outside, the boundaries between the public and private that could be, negotiated and also, influence the perception or the experience of the space, already kind of enlarge the space or retract the space. But in this principle, I really wanted to point out to the notion of program, because I felt that through program, we could expand the boundaries of the project. So for instance, within the boundaries we own or the periphery, the official boundaries, sometimes it's just too small to fit everything within. But the cities provide resources outside these official boundaries that we could also integrate within the project. So I observed that in Hong Kong, for instance, a hill was used as a kind of an expansion of the intimate space and act as a living room. So it's really this kind of expanding the territorial, personal territories to another place in the cities. Or for instance, in one of the back lane, I noticed that the whole lane was kind of an explosions of certain functions that all together recreated the kind of program of a restaurant, for instance, but they were not all limited within the official boundaries that the restaurants officially owned. And I felt that it was really some kind of inspiring for me that through the program we could decide what to include and what not to include, and use the city as a kind of a resource.
Do you find that these spaces were integral to the functioning of the city at large? The big example of that, of course, is Dharavi in Mumbai, where you have a very large informal settlement. We have Kibera in Nairobi, which operates similarly, and others that I've read about and seen, where although these are interstitial spaces, these are third spaces maybe, and often enough undocumented to a certain degree, certainly undefined in a kind of legal and policy way, and often enough occupied by people who live in that kind of liminal space, that penumbral space. They are nonetheless absolutely central to the success and functioning of the city. Did you find that? Did you find that in these spaces, what you actually see is the kind of source waters of urban space and, I guess, the urban economy?
I'm not sure I know the example you're talking about, but
Well, what sort of, for example, in these spaces, do you find a lot of grey economy style activities which are actually central to the production of formal economy things? So, for example, in Mumbai, in Dharavi, there's a lot of battery recycling that's done. There's a lot of metal recycling, a lot of activities which then feed back into not only the formal market, but the rhetoric around reuse, the policies around sustainability, for example. And actually, it's all being done informally. And were it not for those spaces, these things couldn't even function.
Yeah, no, definitely. Well, yeah, definitely. All the space I observed somehow, there were all these kind of activities economically for sure, but sometimes also this is the place where illegal activities are happening, and they're also really important for somehow not the functioning of the city, but I mean, by legal, I mean, like for example, in a Hong Kong park, you cannot really lay down on a bench, or you cannot play cards. These are considered illegal, but these type of activities are happening in the back lanes. So in a way, they're clearly more free for sure. So those spaces are support for the city for sure.
How do you measure this? Again, coming back to your methodology, how do you measure the porosity of these boundaries? How do you measure the territoriality of these spaces, where they reach to? And do you still stay within that street, or do you try and let your study of these liminal spaces start to flow out?
Usually I stay for a long time in the places. So like a good 12 hours usually at observing, like the movement of, the people around and trying to understand what is linked to what, who is connecting to who. For example, the example I gave before about on the restaurants, it was not something very obvious, and you cannot just pass by and discover all this microcosm. So I guess that staying a long time in a place, this is really where you get to learn the subtle ramifications, basically, of those. And I travel usually all as much as I can the places that I'm looking at. For example, the backlinks of Hong Kong, I think I almost went to all of them.
That's challenging talk, that.
So it's not just like a single accident, but usually it's repeated all over the city, and I'm trying to go as much as I can to all the places.
Did you find that these interstitial, these liminal spaces, these voids, did they sort of constitute a second city? Did they know of
And
each other? Were they connected?
definitely. And also to go back to this idea of emptiness, after really traveling to all those interstitial spaces, I realized that they were, in fact, like really far from being empty, but creating in itself a parallel city.
Mm.
Um, yeah, and a very alternative type of city. So I almost kind of forgot the city around. And this is something I'm trying to show also in the drawings.
Mm.
For instance, there is one drawing where I show the network of backlinks in Hong Kong, and I erase all the buildings and highlight in yellow all the gaps. Because to me, after focusing so much on those, they became a new city for me.
Mm. Yeah,
Yeah.
so that's a very fascinating, and I think probably from politicians and police perspective, a very troubling idea, but it's clearly there. How does it compare? How do these void spaces compare to formal open spaces in the city that are defined by planners and designed by architects?
Well, the first thing that comes to mind, obviously, is the regulations. As long as it is planned as an official public space, there is a long list of regulations or things you cannot do. Here, I'm talking specifically about Hong Kong. And but those lists never exist for backlinks. So it's a very fundamental difference, right? You will never have a guard telling you that you cannot do that in a backlink. So to me, they are the most public place of the cities,
Mm.
definitely.
It's a very interesting and a lovely idea, a very seductive idea. And I did want to ask you about the drawings because I assume they are in the book the formal representation of a method of investigation that you undertook on site of drawing. Is that right?
Yes, well, the drawings in the book, they are not the original drawings on each of the investigations. So for each of the investigations, I produce a set of drawings that were kind of helping me also to formalize, to visualize this notion of voids. But when I wanted to do the book, I redraw all the projects
Mm-hmm.
with kind of standardized ID. So that was in a way for me, again, like to sometimes the words didn't come out, and I used the drawing to express basically the learning from the
Mm.
cities. So by redrawing this in a similar way, the sites, but also the spatial project, I could kind of, for myself, also see relationships between each of the
Yeah.
projects.
I mean, I don't want to sound too much like an architecture teacher, but I hope you've kept those drawings because I think that will be an extraordinary resource to look at. I mean, in a way, it's a methodology in its own right, isn't it? The idea of a drawn thing that sits alongside your idea of building interventions as an investigative tool, and then also this kind of ethnographic. I'm going to call it ethnography. You can't stop me.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Give me another deep.
I nearly wrote a paper on this about 7 years ago. I gave a paper in New York on it. This idea of a kind of form of ethnography, very similar to the one you're describing, where you act in a space and watch what happens. And the way that I likened it was that it was like if you want to understand fluid dynamics, you can throw a stone in a pool and watch
Definitely.
the ripples, and that will give you more information than just looking at the flat surface of the water. And for me, that feels like what you're doing here is
Yeah, definitely.
you're interrupting things, and that
Mhm.
causes a reaction, and then you know.
No, definitely. Yeah, definitely.
Your fifth principle, being frugal.
Mhm.
This is interesting. And maybe, and this follows the introduction by Thomas Daniel, this idea that people are being frugal in these spaces is interesting because maybe they're just being poor. Could you talk a little bit about this idea of frugality as you encountered it and as you understand it?
Well, again, I need to make clear that these principles are addressed to architects. So being frugal is addressed to architects.
Mm-hmm.
And we don't have the same role, I would say, or not the same role, but the same attitude as perhaps the people in the street, of course, because it doesn't come from necessity, right? Their struggle is the limitation of resources, whether if it's money or material or space, and they need to deal with that. And when they deal with that, they come out with ingenious and very inventive solutions, which I admire, definitely. And I learn from that. But they're also very individualistic and they have their own way of operating within the cities. That for us, architect, designers, planners, we don't have the same role. And it's very difficult. And I will not encourage any architect to just mimic what they're doing. I don't think it would be very honest. But for us, it's to acknowledge this frugality as somehow something that we could maybe design spaces in a more frugal way. So it's directly addressed to the architects.
Could you
Even
define that use of the word frugal then? What do you mean specifically? Do you mean less?
yes, less, but for the best.
Mm-hmm.
um, yeah, for example, the people that I observe, they usually, or the non-professional, they make the most with the very little. And I wish that we could apply the same attitudes to
Mm-hmm.
architecture, make the most with very little. Welcoming constraints as a way to kind of try to act within this in a, but then not always asking for more, but trying to see how we could, with precise intervention, for instance, or more strategic interventions, do the most with the less.
Mm-hmm.
So that's more, yeah, I'd like to advocate for this frugal attitude as an architect. It's also because maybe it's a kind of reactions I have towards earlier, right? There was similar fascinations for this kind of spontaneous space and maybe a little bit more modernist attitude of, an aesthetic of chaos, which again, I find mimicking what I see in the street, that looks a little bit chaotic, is perhaps also lack of honesty. So rather, I wanted to kind of, counter react to this
Mm-hmm.
aesthetic of chaos, but providing a more, frugal attitude and more honest.
That sort of speaks to ideas of professional versus lay knowledge, doesn't it? This idea that architects who come from this background of professional knowledge, which is, I think, characterized probably most easily as knowledge held outside the person in a way, and lay knowledge being spoken and oral. How did you find that? Was there in these communities, in these spaces, was there the presence of professional formal knowledge? And was the negotiation about how you subvert that? Or was it that that conversation didn't even really exist in those spaces? That decision making was being done absent all of that?
Yeah, I think there was an absence of that. So an absence of, like professional training for sure, but I would consider the user of this space as my teachers.
Mm,
Um, for, like all the kind of ingenuity they have. This is something I learned directly as a,
mm,
maybe I could consider them as a craftsman or as expert in the, like understanding of the space
mhm,
itself. Even the elderly people, who hike in the hills, the one I study in Tsuen Kwan Ho in Hong Kong, just because they know so much about the environments. So they are the expert, and the way how they kind of deal or transform little by little the environment makes them experts,
mm,
even if they're not trained, of course. But I'm fascinated by that, and I acknowledge the value of that. But I think as an architect, it's a little bit different because you have kind of a responsibility that they don't have. And I think we should not put the weight towards them, but more support these interventions to happen. So we kind of the facilitator in that. Yeah.
It seems to me that there is at the heart of this a sort of perceptual problematic, which is that in these spaces as you describe them, they seem to not operate in that linear temporal realm which architectural production has to operate in. You go through a series of phases towards an endpoint over time, whereas what you seem to be describing is spaces in which there is a kind of assumed flow or sort of outside time, like actions happen, but it's not towards.
Yeah, and this is maybe something we could also learn as architect is how much you plan ahead and how much you plan along the way, for instance. So in my fourth principle, where I try to talk more about, the movement along the time, perhaps there is a reflection we could have as architect on how much you need to plan in advance, and can you allow a little bit of, moment for testing things. So yeah, the flow is definitely different. But again, if you observe this mechanism, they will kind of come naturally. It's something that sometimes we are a little bit afraid of letting go, or feels the need to control all the stages very, very kind of, truthfully. So maybe it's, again, the idea of withdrawing a little bit from this over-controlling process.
As a final question, and again, it comes to this idea of what can we learn in contexts beyond Southeast Asia and East Asia. How did you find the people that existed in these spaces managed this spatial production process? How did they do it? What was involved in it? Were there formal meetings, or was it always a kind of personal negotiation within the context of, I suppose, and this sounds ridiculous, but good manners? Like, you don't do things that will completely demolish the livelihoods of your neighbors.
Well, I guess.
Because I think this is really important for architects, because it's the talking to people at the beginning that we've got these kind of techniques and tools, haven't we? Participatory design and design charrettes and blah, 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 blah. But again, they're neat, tight, not open-ended, controlled by professional knowledge, controlled by the habitus of the profession. So I kind of really think that this, for me, would be one of the great things to take away.
Well, I don't know if I can really answer, but what I could observe about the mechanism of the people using or making the space is really two things. One thing is that it's very individualistic. So it's something that is very difficult for us as a planner to do, because it's really based on the individual input of each of the individual. They were not, as far as I could observe, not so many meetings or agreements on things. It's very individualistic. I go there and I do that, and I go there and I do that, and I move and I leave and I transform. So that's one thing. And the other thing was perhaps that because most of the place I observed were how to say, they had this illegal component. So no one was really owning the space. So they were all the borrower of the space. So of course they had to intuitively negotiate, but not necessarily verbally. But because they did that, and then I'm not disturbing too much my neighbor, then the other one can react and will agree and not, for example, call the police. So there is this kind of tacit negotiations that with the individualistic attitude kind of work, because nothing is really stable. So the instability is allowing this, or not allowing, but is optimal for this kind of scenarios to happen. But as soon as the people own the space, then it's done. They will put frames and the barricades. So the instability, because if it's not legal, this is, yeah, it does a lot. So how to apply that to us as planner and architects, it's something we can't mimic that. But what we can do is perhaps save some areas where things are not completely decided or defined or overregulated, leaving some gaps and some buffers for things to happen. This is, I believe that this is what we can do to set up a platform for things to happen, but also to take the responsibility of why we can plan or why we have to plan. The infrastructure, for instance, very kind of pragmatic aspect that the people themselves, they cannot put in place, the bathrooms, the pipes and things, but leaving some room for them to act in between.
Great. That's a lovely point to finish on. Friederike, thank you so much, Géraldine. It's been amazing reading the book and a delight to meet you and hear you talk.
Thanks a lot. I hope it was okay.
Even the too fixed stare of the wide windows give momentary access to the landscape behind or under the future cracks in the plaster, when the houses, capsized, will slide obliquely into the clay seas, gradual as glaciers that right now nobody notices. Margaret Atwood, FTW. Thanks to Géraldine for the conversation and for generously sending me an actual book all the way from Hong Kong. That was extremely lovely. Please see the podcast description for links to it and to Géraldine professionally and socially. And thanks for listening.